It can be said that Unitarian Universalists are a particularly wordy people. And in fairness, look what I get to do for a living. And, okay, let's be honest. Settle in and get comfortable. We UUs spend a lot of time talking about what we think is true, what we think is right. We think about things, decide what's right, and take positions. But here's the thing. None of that was what Spork needed to become part of the community. As much as we UUs love to think, talk, argue, and search for truth and meaning, these activities alone do not build trust. They build knowledge or awareness or the kind of connection that comes from striving together. But talking about our ideas doesn't build trust. Talking about our lives and having our truth received and held dear, that does. Trust isn't just a cognitive experience, it's quite emotional. And if we are part of a religious tradition that prides itself in and even maybe prioritizes thinking, well, we have to work all the harder to build trust. Spork had no reason to trust the utensils that were in charge. Not simply because they ignored Spork, but also because they did not know or care about Spork's life. They did what they had always done the way they had always done it. They didn't know or care to make space for Spork. What was Spork like? What they needed or what they cared about? Spork had no experience of connection or care, and therefore trust with them. In reconstructing the kitchen, the other utensils spoke with Spork and learned about Spork's lives and the lives of others who were like Spork or different from both themselves and Spork. They started following people like Spork on social media and reading books that offered new information, perspective, and experience. They didn't simply see a problem with drawers and build a new one that was just like the first one, only bigger. They connected with Spork in a way that meant that later on they would not ignore Spork in another situation. They would know Spork deeply, and Spork could trust them because they had made themselves trustworthy. They restructured everything by changing their perspective, their behavior, and their environment. Now, in congregational life, when it's not a children's story, with our discussions of funding and polity and the next social justice project, we spend a lot of time searching for what's right, what is best. In striving to be right, when we're doing that, we're living in our cognitive brains, basically competing for rightness. When we do that, it becomes a battle. And battles are not beloved community. Now, let me be clear, in the right circumstances, this competing for rightness, this battle, it is absolutely necessary. We battle systemic racial oppression. We battle patriarchal and transphobic laws about controlling people's rights to bodily autonomy. We battle police and governmental misconduct. And we battle encroaching fascism. And if arguing and battling is our most common, for some of us even our most comfortable way of interacting, it interferes with building beloved community among ourselves. Even if it's not how we want to engage, it's often how we were taught to engage. Bearing witness is different. When we bear witness to people who share about the experience of their lives, we must, at the same time, consistently notice and then set aside our own thoughts and assumptions, our judgments, assessments of things that don't make sense to us yet because we don't maybe have the whole picture. We must recognize when what we are bearing witness to is so different from our own experience that we have to be careful not to dismiss it out of hand. When we are in a moment of bearing witness, we prioritize the story someone else is telling over the questions that we have, or where we would like their story to go, or how we mentally fill in the gaps in the story they tell. Oh, that's probably because, oh wait, no. Refocus. We return again and again simply to the story they tell us, and we set aside again and again, as immediately as possible, our assumptions that we have brought to that moment. When we can still our minds and be present with someone, then we are able to meaningfully express empathy. We can make space to say, oh wow, that must have been hard. And, oh my goodness, I am so sorry that happened. You did not deserve that. And, that's amazing. I am so honored that you told me that. When we tell the stories of our lives, people have the opportunity to hold space for the unveiling of more of us. And I don't mean here just chit-chat about our grandkids' sports ball game or humble bragging about a promotion or an info dump about our favorite hobby, but stories of our struggle for survival, our curiosity of who we are and why we do what we do, our learning and our growing. When we bear witness to the stories of people's lives, we take seriously what we were taught about others, and we consider how, or even if, what we were taught was actually true. Part of how we make ourselves trustworthy is by not believing everything we think. Now, this isn't the same with agreeing with a political opinion. It's meeting one another at the center of humanity, where we share how the world impacts us, what it's like to be us in a world that may or may not appreciate our uniqueness. It's not about what we think in those moments, it's about who we are and who we are together. But we so often don't experience that, do we? We all too often experience people trying to fix us or our situation, or worse, they tell us our experience is wrong. And all too often, it is we who try to fix things for others. When I was a kid growing up on a small, stony farm, I only knew about two genders, girl and boy. And I had two choices there within girl. There was girl or failed girl, just as there was boy or failed boy. Where I lived, they called a failed boy a sissy or a fairy, and they called a failed girl a tomboy. People policed what a girl or boy was, and if we were performing it properly. I didn't have an individual right to identity. Society decided for me that I was to capitulate, to cram myself into one or the other, boy or girl, man or woman, but I wasn't either. We didn't have words for this back then, if you need to guess, 1970s. As I got older, I worked really hard to find words that would describe my gender. I'm butch. I'm a butch dyke. That was the 80s. I'm a tomboy farm girl. I tried for a while. I'm a masculine of center person. That worked-ish. But none of the words fit, and for a long time I finally just strung them all together, and I said, I'm a butch queer tomboy farm girl, masculine of center, womanish type person. That's long for an introduction. It seemed unnecessary. In all the decades since I was that child, we have developed better understanding, knowledge, and language. There's now a much simpler for my gender, coined not by the society that only wants there to be two, but by people who share my experience of gender. I'm genderqueer. I'm non-binary, a gender that does not fall into the Western cultural idea of man and woman as opposites. Look how simple that got. I'm trans, meaning I'm across from the gender people expect me to have in a body that people called female. Not a man, not a woman, sort of both, but also neither. And people regularly tell me I'm wrong. There's a term called gaslighting that you might be familiar with. It means to manipulate someone into questioning their sanity. It comes from a movie of the same name, and in that movie, an abusive husband attempted to make his wife think that she was mentally unwell, to question her own experience of reality by, among other things, adjusting the lighting, a gas lamp, gaslighting. See how that works? Yeah, okay, just making sure. He would adjust it downward, and when she would say, "It's dark in here," he would say, "No, it's not." He did this repeatedly until it got to the point where he pretended to read the newspaper in the pitch dark, telling her she was crazy. This wasn't about her cognition. This wasn't about her ability to think. This was about her very experience of her body in the world. The goal of gaslighting is to get someone to disbelieve what they experience of reality and replace it with someone else's experience. This is different than discussing or persuading someone to think differently. This is designed to manipulate them into not trusting their own experience. This happens all too often in our personal and religious lives. People who are like Spork, people who do not experience their gender in the same way as broader society tells them they're supposed to, these people are gaslit in our society every day. People say, "There's no such thing as trans. There's no such thing as non-binary. There have been men and women for thousands of years, and that's it." Sometimes they go further and accuse people of trying to take people's right to be cisgender away or corrupting the children. Those of you who remember the anti-gay activity of the 80s and 90s will recognize these tropes. The reasoning inside folks' heads usually boils down to some version of this, I think. Because I'm not trans, I'm not non-binary, it doesn't make sense to me. And then the problem becomes, so I don't believe you. Now, this is a more familiar experience than may seem at first, and we're here talking about bearing witness and how we position ourselves to bear witness. And in order to do that, we must reflect on the ways we sometimes are challenged to do so, or others have challenged us to do so. Because being gaslit about our own bodies is a really familiar experience. Those of us who are survivors of dysfunctional families and abuse, or illnesses like long Lyme, long COVID, fibromyalgia, myalgic encephalitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, and other post-viral illnesses that people told us didn't exist and we didn't have. Or heck, how many of us here were told there was no such thing as PMS, even while we were weeping in pain? So many of us have experienced being surrounded by people who tell us we are wrong or broken. There are those of us who were told that we were bad and lazy when it turned out we were just neurodivergent, but nobody knew what it was back then. We have experienced people tell us that our lives, our experience in the world is invalid because it differs from theirs. It must be all in our heads, made up. We must be able to cram ourselves into the kind of brain they have. Some version of, I don't have that, I've never heard of that like that, I don't believe you. And then this is more broadly true for all of us who are survivors of and live with pervasive white supremacy, sexism, racism, homophobia, classism, anti-Semitism, trans antagonism, and ableism, and more, even in the face of an emerging consensus among affected people. So many others will say, well, I don't know. I've never seen oppression like you described. It's not really that bad. And what they mean is, I don't believe you. And I must acknowledge that I have been on both sides of this. I have been both the person whose reality is challenged by someone else, whose experience is different, and I have been the person who used my own experience and believed my own thoughts to judge others. If you have me back sometime, probably online, I will share some of the ways I am my very own cautionary tale. Yeah. But for right now, this. I'm descended from about 400 years of Puritans and other white settlers in Massachusetts. I come from people with names like Harbottle Grimscott. And regardless of your family history, if you're you, we are all deeply bound up in this Puritan congregational Unitarian history as well. I come from generations of people who, when someone dies, says, literally, well, that's too bad, got to get on with it, there's work to do. I come from people for whom grieving is private and internal and set aside as quickly as possible. And sympathy or empathy, if even offered, is shaken off. Oh, it was his time. Feelings, in general, are meant to be things that flash past, darting like a bird that never lands. And our own judgment, we are taught, is almost certainly right. We were taught that we are the smartest people with the most common sense. The others are certainly wrong. I was taught judgment rather than curiosity, and critical thinking without emotional competence. I grew up knowing only 3 feeling words: mad, sad, and what was the other one again? Oh yeah, mad. Now, personally, I think that this also means that since I come from a long line of people who, because we were never taught what it is to deeply experience what we're experiencing, our Puritan roots and family cultures lead us to gaslight even ourselves. We were never helped to find our words for our gender, never fully supported to experience grief or to name or even differentiate emotions. You mean joy and glad aren't the same thing? I said at age 34. So much of our whole culture prioritizes what we should think, what we should be, how we should be, and what we should be feeling over learning who we actually are. Some of us are knives that want to hang out with hatchets, and it's not about gender. If we weren't taught how to notice and honor and bear our own feelings in our experiences of grief, gender, or otherwise, how could we possibly bear witness to others? How on earth could we express an empathy that is actually meaningful and believable? So many of us were never taught how to be present with our feelings, never mind accept others. Now, some of us, having realized that what our families had taught us about life was perhaps less helpful than they thought, or that our coping mechanisms that kept all those weird feelings at bay had accidentally turned into a drug or alcohol problem, Well, we joined support groups or recovery groups. Some of us joined covenant groups and small group ministry. And we may have been perplexed when we first entered those rooms and found people just sitting quietly, listening to each other, sometimes nodding. Personally, I started out being judgmental, having been taught that that was what you do. That's what a human does, one assesses. I started out being judgmental of other people who took up so much time talking about themselves. Oh my goodness, what an ego-driven thing, I thought. Wow, it sure is all about me in here. I had been taught that anything about me was too much. Others of us took to it like fish to water. Finally, I can talk about my life and my experience without being interrupted, corrected, or scolded. Over time, I finally learned that this is how humans grow, connect, and develop best. Trust in relationship. And it's a core part of beloved community that we learn to listen deeply and trust that others will listen to us deeply, will let us share at our own pace, and will believe what we say about our experience. In beloved community, we learn that people will maintain our confidence, protect our autonomy, and hold space for us to be different, and then hold space for us to be different again in a new way. We learn that there are those who will join us in making changes to create more flexible and responsive spaces and processes in our communities. For some of us, this is the opposite of how we grew up. And so many of us are now learning to tell our truth and bear witness to others at the same time, later in life, 60 years old, after decades of thinking we had a handle not only what life was like, but that it's like that for everyone, isn't it? As we practice this, we learn to just listen, to suspend judgment, to notice and dismiss, or at least check out our assumptions. Well, after a while, those of us who've been doing this, we find ourselves doing it elsewhere, bearing witness to people. We start noticing and resisting the impulse to be right every single moment. Could it just wait? It really could. Resist the impulse to tell someone what to do or to fix it for them so their feelings stop bothering us. We started to resist the impulse to do anything that would move other people's discomfort away from us so that we did not have to also experience any discomfort. We bore witness to friends. We sat and held space for people after tragedy. We learned to be present in someone's feelings without taking them in, to be empathetic without drowning in emotion. And the next thing you know, we really were bearing witness willy-nilly all over the place. I'll close with a story. Just as the pandemic was starting up, I, along with the rest of the town, was in the supermarket doing that first initial big stock up on staples. You remember that. It was crowded and tense. There was a man in his 80s with that bent and gnarled but stalwart posture like my dad. He stood confused in the soup aisle, but clearly was not moving until he got what he needed. There's a lot of soup in the soup aisle. I paused and said, "Are you okay? Can I help?" He asked me if I knew where the mushroom soup was. I said, "Well, there's a few different kinds. Do you know which kind you need?" He told me he didn't really know. His wife had always cooked, and he didn't know what to get now that she'd died. He was grief-stricken and frightened, and I simply bore witness. I stood there in that moment as people passed us for 10 minutes, and I listened to him talk about his wife and her cooking, how confusing the grocery store is, and how he regretted not going with her to shop. It had always been her job. In the end, I helped him pick 2 kinds of soup to try. Mushroom soup wasn't what he needed that day. Sure, he needed to buy it, but what he needed was for someone to see him, to bear witness to the way his life had completely changed, to how he was bereft and didn't know how he would move forward. It was an honor to be present with him in that aisle. As I paused in my panic and warded off people crashing carts into us, I was changed by that brief experience. When we are present, just present with someone, we open ourselves and them up to all manner of possibilities. And when we try not to control the possibilities or the outcome, but to just let it happen, miracles of connection, of trust, and of real change can happen. And what happens is nothing we can predict, and so much more than we expect, and so much more beautiful. Amen. Blessed be. And may it be so because we make it so.